Welcome to another Dynasty Rankings Deep Dive. Today I'll be taking you through my top 60 running backs. Who should you buy? Who should you sell? And how should you value them against this year's rookies? All that and more on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome back to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also check out my full rankings at ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can follow us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down and follow us on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Today I'm talking about running backs. And running backs are one of the hardest positions to rank in Dynasty because how you value them really depends on whether your team is in win now mode or whether you're trying to rebuild. Obviously, if you're trying to win now, it doesn't matter how old your running backs are. You just want the best players right now, and you really should nearly be looking at redraft rankings. If you're rebuilding, though, you need to think about when your window is. Are you going to be winning in the next season or two, in which case you should be taking on players that are at least established, or are you looking a couple of years down the road, in which case you might not even want to be drafting running backs yet at all. There's a lot to break down, so let's get into it. Now, my number one guy at the moment is Bijan Robinson, and this is mainly about age and how we project his usage in this new offense. Obviously, he was wasted a bit last year, but he still managed to manage the top 12 season, and that's a good sign. The problem is we don't know exactly what's going to happen next time around, but you have to feel like the Falcons are going to be better this year and are going to be better in using him. So I'm expecting him to be a top option. We know that running backs that are drafted early do tend to have excellent careers. It is a very projectable position. So for that reason, if he can stay healthy, and that hasn't been an issue for him so far, I expect that he's at least going to be a good, reliable option. I think a top 5 finish is well within his means in the next couple of seasons. I don't think there's really that much threat from other players coming through. So I feel like he's a guy I feel most strongly about and certainly feel like you can rely on. The only guys that are really close to him are firstly Bryce Hall, who obviously was disappointing in his first season because of injury and was hampered by that a little bit into his second season, but he still managed a top 5 fantasy season, and that shows just how good he can be. It is a bit concerning that the Jets have brought in 2 running backs, but I think that's more of an indication of what they want to do if he gets injured again. They really struggled when he was injured, so they're going to want to bring in cover that can make things work while he's not there. They have brought in some big backs. Braylon Allen's the guy that worries me the most. He's more of a goal line back threat, but you have to feel like Bryce Hall's still going to get the bulk of the carries. He's extremely talented. He's clearly the number one option here, and this offense should be a lot better this year with Aaron Rodgers back and a lot more weapons around him. So for that reason, I feel like Hall's a guy you can rely on for the next few seasons, and he's likely also to have a long career. He's still only 22, so there's a lot of good years ahead of him. You should expect that you're going to get 6 or 7 seasons out of him. So he's a guy I'm targeting if I'm doing a startup league, or alternatively, if I'm trying to rebuild a little bit and I'm willing to give up a lot of assets for a guy who can help me in the long term. So Hall's a good option, and if you're trying to win now, Christian McCaffrey is the guy. This shouldn't be a shock. He has been the number one running back for a few years now. In fact, he's got several number one finishes, and realistically, he's gone to an even better offense than he was in previously, and that's only helped him. We've seen how good he's been the last couple of seasons. You know he's probably going to be the number one running back this year, assuming he can stay healthy, and his health's been pretty reliable for the most part of late. So I would expect that he's a guy that I'd be targeting if you're trying to win now. I'd be doing anything I can to get my hands on him, being willing to give up a lot of future assets because you know he's a guy that can help you win your league. So if you're trying to win now and you're not rebuilding, go for McCaffrey. If you're in a bit of a rebuild, you're only going to get another year or two of McCaffrey being a real gun. You're probably better off selling high. There are going to be people that are going to be able to give up a whole lot for him. And for that reason, he's all about exactly where you are right now. The same thing happens in a startup. You have to know within a round or two of your startup dynasty league whether you're aiming to win straight away or whether you're going to be starting off a little soft and bringing in a whole lot of young players. If you're starting a bit soft and you're going for young players, you definitely don't need McCaffrey. There's not a lot of value there in the long term, but there's massive value there in the short term if you're going to go in and try to win now. Jahmyr Gibbs is a guy on the other end of the spectrum where realistically, I think even going into his second season, we're not exactly sure what to expect from him. There are a lot of touches to David Montgomery when he was healthy, but Gibbs still managed a top 10 finish, and that's a really good sign. You have to feel like they're going to give him a little bit more of the workload this year, but it's still going to be very much a committee approach with Montgomery. I feel like you want to bring Gibbs in because you know that there's a lot of quality there. He's an excellent running back. They intentionally traded up to get him early last year, and rightly so, because there are a lot of other teams going for him. So for that reason, I feel like they are valuing him highly. They're going to use him a lot. They realistically don't have a lot of weapons. Their second wide receiver is Williams, and they've got nothing behind that. They've even let go of Josh Reynolds. So it's hard to know who they're going to give the ball to if it's not their running backs, Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta. It's all going to filter through those guys, and Gibbs is going to be the receiving back in that situation. So there's plenty of value there. Gibbs is a good guy to be getting while it's still a little bit of a buy low given how he was used last season. Speaking of buy lows, Jonathan Taylor obviously not been used very well the last couple of seasons, but the Colts have been very clear. He's the guy. They haven't brought in any competition at all. And they've let Zack Moss go, who was the clear backup last year. They've still got guys like Trey Sermon, for example, as the backup, and they were able to perform okay in this offense because this offense is a really good run offense. But Taylor's the more talented back. He's going to get as many carries as he can handle. They're going to run him into the ground as much as they can because they know once his contract's over, they can just let him go and move on. So he's a player that I think is a good option for the next season or two. He's another McCaffrey type where you're going to get some value out of him, but you get a little bit more long-term with him. He's 3 years younger than McCaffrey, and there's still plenty of upside here. It's only a few years removed from a top-tier first overall finish. So for that reason, I think Taylor's someone you can buy low on a little bit. Even though he's in my top 5, a lot of people aren't valuing him there. The only risk is there is a little bit of name value there, and that might cause people to want to hold on to him. But I think there's going to be plenty of people that are willing to sell on him. You just might have missed the window for now. Kyren Williams is definitely a guy that you can buy low on. With Blake Corum coming in, I think a lot of people are going to be very concerned. I'm not as concerned. I think Corum's more coming in as a third-round option, as more of a backup who'll be used a little bit, especially on passing downs. Williams was used an incredible amount last season. There were games where he was on for every single offensive play. That's not going to happen over the long term. That's not sustainable. There's a reason he missed games last season because they were overusing him. They're going to bring in Corum to spell him, but I don't think this is going to be a true committee. Williams is still the main guy. He managed a top 5 finish in 12 games last season. So if we assume that he only gets 75% of the carries as he did last season, which should also mean he's more efficient, well, that's still another top 5 finish. There's plenty of upside there, even with Corum coming in. Even if it's a pretty even split, this Rams offense is pretty good. They're giving a lot of touches to their running backs. I'm not particularly worried about Kyren Williams at all. He's the guy I want to be trying to get into my teams because I feel like the upside's there. They believe he is the guy. Corum is simply there as a backup. Travis Etienne's another guy that was a bit of a surprise. There was a lot of rumblings coming out of Jacksonville that potentially they're bringing in other guys like Tank Bigsby, who they drafted in the 3rd round, another example, the team drafting a 3rd-round player and then still using their main running back. Etienne was still the number 2 overall running back last year. He was very impressive. There is a good chance that'll continue this year. They're, of course, saying, oh, no, we're definitely going to give a lot more carries to the other guys. We don't want Etienne to have as many carries as last year. But they said that for last season as well. You can't trust that at all. He's clearly the number 1 option there. Sure, Dearness Johnson's fine. They're going to want to get Tank Bigsby involved a little bit more because they did draft him for a reason. But it's still Etienne's backfield to use. I'm not worried at all about his usage. He's still a clear top 10 running back. I wouldn't be going out of my way to get him because he had such a good finish last year. There is a little bit of implicit risk. But if you got him, he's not a guy that you should necessarily be trying to sell unless someone's willing to give you the farm for him. Devon Achane, another guy that comes with a little bit of risk. We saw he was excellent when given the opportunities last year. The fact that they've now brought in a rookie is, of course, a little bit of a concern as well. But I still think Achane's the main guy here. Raheem Mostert is into his 30s now. He's nominally the starter, but we saw Achane get used a lot. Having a top 24 finish when you only play 11 games and weren't even particularly involved for some of those games that you played is a really good sign. There were times where he just took over and dominated in the second half and put hundreds of yards down with massive amounts of touchdowns. He can do that if given limited touches. So for that reason, he's a guy I'm willing to take a risk on. He's a top 10 option, but there's a lot more risk. So you're talking about a guy that you kind of swing for the fences with a little bit. If he's that extra piece that's going to take you over the edge, I don't think this is the risk you should be taking. I think this is a guy that you're wanting if you're trying to rebuild and you want to take a couple of swings, knowing if it doesn't work out, it's still going to be okay. But if it does work out, this is a guy who could be good for 5, 6, 7 seasons because he's so young. After him, Rashad White's another guy who's taken a hit, and I think you can probably buy low on him. You saw he finished 6th overall. They bring in Bucky Irving, but I don't think this is a true committee. I think Irving's being brought in as more of a change of pace back and more of a passing downs back. He's a smaller guy. White's still the main guy. We saw that at Arizona State when he was in college. He was spelled quite often. He was really never an every down back. And yet last season, they still managed to use him that way. He wasn't as effective, but he was still pretty good. So I suspect they dial back his touches a little bit, but he's still going to be a clear starting running back. I think he's a reliable option. I still have him in my top 10, but there is a bit of a gap below those main top guys, especially those top 7 down to Achane, who's got some risk, and White, who definitely has a lot of risk, but also a lot of upside as a guy who could still potentially be the main back in this backfield. Isaiah Pacheco is another guy who's very interesting. They let people go this season. They've got less backs there. They don't have Jerick McKinnon there anymore. Seems like Clyde Edwards-Helaire will probably take over that role unless they bring McKinnon in later on. They haven't really brought anyone else in who's going to be a real threat. Pacheco was solid last season, but he wasn't used as much as he could be. They tended to take him off on the goal line, and they brought in Jerick McKinnon. But as the season went on, they used Pacheco a little bit more. And we saw he was pretty effective in the playoffs as well. So the fact that he had a top 13 finish, despite not really being used the way I expect he'll be used this season, is a very good sign. I think that this season, he's going to be the main back, and they're going to give him a lot more touches, kind of taking them back in that Kareem Hunt direction they used a while back. I think that they see Clyde Edwards-Helaire as a backup and a guy they can use on 3rd and long, but I think Pacheco's the main guy for the most part, and for that reason, he's a top 10 running back for me in Dynasty, especially because he's still pretty young, and that offense we know is going to be good for a few years to come. Saquon Barkley is an interesting one for me. He does drop, but I do like the landing spot. We do know how effective players have been with the Eagles. They didn't bring him any true competition. I do like Will Shipley, but realistically, this is going to be Barkley's backfield. We know they give a lot of touches to their running backs because they only have limited weapons. They've got 2 wide receivers and a tight end and their running back, and everything filters through them. The problem with the Eagles running backs is that Jalen Hurts takes so many touches on the goal line. Now, of course, if the tush push isn't available, we probably see more running back runs in those short yardage situations, and that could probably help Barkley. But the big issue with Barkley is, can he even stay healthy? If you look through the previous finishes there on the screen, he's had, one healthy finish in the last 5 seasons. That's a bit of an issue. He's still getting in most of the games, but he's not as explosive because of these injuries, and that's a big concern. He's also aging a little bit. He's really only 1 year behind Christian McCaffrey. I feel like he's a guy that you either take if you're winning now, because there is a lot of upside here. I feel like he probably should be a top 10 back this season, but there's a massive amount of risk. There's injury risk. He could lose touches. There's a lot of concerns, and for that reason, take him with risk, knowing there's upside, but only if you're trying to win within the next season or 2. Kenneth Walker is another guy who comes with plenty of risk. He's got back-to-back top 19 finishes, top 20 finishes, but he's still young. We know this is a good offense. He needs to get a little bit better, but I feel like he's going to be getting the majority of the touches. Zach Chabanet was pretty disappointing. I don't see him taking over. At worst, it's committee, but I feel like this is mainly Walker's backfield for now. He's still got a couple of years at Seattle, and I feel like he probably after that can just move on to another team who's probably going to use him as the main running back as well. That gives him a little bit more security of the ability to play on every single down, and that's why I've got him ranked a little bit higher than a lot of these aging guys and these younger guys who can't play on every down. He's just got more upside, but lots of risk, like Barkley, but more long-term upside. So I'd be taking him if I'm rebuilding and someone else is willing to sell low because they're a little bit scared of the Zach Charbonnet situation, for example. Jonathan Brooks is my first rookie, and he is well ahead of those other guys. He falls into the best landing spot by far. He's the clear number 1 guy for me, but realistically, second-round rookies for running backs is really a first-round rookie for most other offensive positions. Running backs are falling so much later in drafts, and this is a weak running back class, but even so, Brooks is still a good player, and I think in many years in most other positions, and certainly in years 5-10 years ago. He's going in the first round based on talent and how much better he is than the other guys in this class. Obviously, he's coming off injury, which means you're not going to get the greatest outcomes from him immediately, but I do feel like long-term he's an excellent option. If I was building a fantasy team now or rebuilding an existing team and I had to bring in any running back, Brooks is probably the guy I'd target because I think he's probably got the most longevity there. Plus, there's plenty of upside in an offense that we've seen has made Christian McCaffrey very successful and has since brought in other backs who are very mediocre and still managed to have success. I don't think Chuba Hubbard is much of a risk. Plus, he's only got 1 year left on his contract. I feel this is 100% Brooks' backfield. They'll use him in the passing game and in the running game. They'll use him on the goal line. I feel like there's very few strong every down backs that people aren't really aware are going to be so valued. So in rookie drafts, everyone's going to be going for him because he's the top running back. And in a startup, I feel like he's falling a little bit. I did a startup with the CBS Sports guys about a week ago, and he fell surprisingly far. No one was interested in him because all those familiar names are the guys that everyone's going towards. Brooks is going to give you the best long-term value of everyone for me. James Cook is another really interesting one. He had a top 12 finish last season, and he wasn't even used very much. They were bringing in a lot of other guys to get touches. Latavius Murray was involved, for example, but they've once again brought in a replacement player. I'm very nervous about Ray Davis. He's a guy that can take not only some passing down touches, but also some goal line touches. They're the value touches. You don't want to be getting the touches between the 20s. You want to be getting the touches on third downs when you're getting those receiving bonuses in PPR leagues, and you want to be getting the touches on the goal line so that you can get touchdown points. That really hurts Cook. And for that reason, he's fallen a little bit for me. He's not the clear number one running back anymore, but we're still talking about a guy who's a very explosive, talented back. I feel like whatever team has him is probably going to use him in a bit of a committee, and that's why he's a little bit lower down. But realistically, he's still going to give you reliable usage for at least another 4 or 5 seasons, and that has plenty of value. Plus, we're talking about the Bills, which is a very powerful offense. We don't know how Ray Davis is going to go. So there is still the upside of Cook being the every down back. I just think there's a significant risk that it's more of a committee than most people are expecting. Now, DeAndre Swift also moves once again into a good situation coming out of Philly, where he did a pretty good job after originally being in Detroit, which is another fantastic running offense. He goes to another offense that just seems to be able to get it to work no matter what running back they have. Clearly, they weren't happy with the 3 guys they had last year. They've let Foreman go. Roschon Johnson was a bit of a disappointment, and we haven't really quite seen what we were hoping for out of Khalil Herbert. So for that reason, DeAndre Swift should be the clear number one guy. He's still really young. He came into the league young, and he's still young. He turns 25 this season, but he's still very young. He's still got 4 or 5 years in him, I think, if he can stay healthy. The problem is he hasn't really been able to stay healthy. He's missed games pretty much every season. But even so, he's still managing top 24 seasons. For that reason, if he can stay healthy, he's going to do a lot better, especially because he's going to have a cleaner role here, I think, and he's going to be able to stay injury-free. Even though he played enough games last season, he was still banged up early in the season. He wasn't even going to be the starting running back in week 1, except Kenny Gainwell got injured. So we're talking about a situation where his touches were a little bit ugly. The team didn't really trust him not to get injured. We don't know how the Bears are going to feel about him. They might be willing to give him every single touch. So I think it's going to be very interesting, but there's plenty of upside there. Josh Jacobs is another one moving house. He's going to Green Bay, who has been fantastic in the run game. They've made Aaron Jones look amazing. Now, to be fair, maybe Aaron Jones just is amazing. AJ Dillon's looked very mediocre. And if Josh Jacobs is going to be getting those touches, that's a little bit of a concern. I believe, though, that he's taking over that Aaron Jones role. That is a very useful role to have in fantasy. It's very valuable. So I think that we're not going to have another low finish like last year. We're talking about a guy with plenty of upside. Now, the fact they brought Lloyd in is a bit of a concern. Anytime a team brings in a rookie running back, especially in the 3rd round, that's a worry. But I do believe this is Jacobs' backfield. They paid him for a reason. I think this is a situation where you're going to see Jacobs get a lot of touches. I'm feeling really positive about him next season. He's still actually surprisingly young because he was drafted pretty young as a 3-year college player. So for that reason, I'm still willing to take him in Dynasty, but more so if I'm trying to win now. If you're rebuilding, there's really no value for Jacobs because in 2 or 3 years, you don't know what he's going to offer you. Joe Mixon's another guy that falls into that category. He's a win-now player. He's had some issues with injuries, but when he's been healthy, he's been fantastic. He's been finishing the top 10 whenever healthy. That Bengals offense does use him a lot, but surely Houston's going to use him as well. We saw Houston coming out and saying, oh, yeah, no, Dameon Pierce is going to be a big part of our offense. There's no way that's true. They weren't using him last season. They've just brought in an expensive and talented back. It's going to be Mixon's backfield. We'll still see some touches from Pierce in random situations like second and short, third and short, and we'll probably see a good Moale in third and very, very long, for example. But Mixon can play on every down. There's plenty of upside there. He's just got to stay healthy. So if he can stay healthy, I think it can be very valuable for the next 2 or 3 seasons, but you're not looking much past that. So you want to be winning now if you're going to get any value out of Joe Mixon. Trey Benson's on the other end of the spectrum, of course. He's a rookie coming in. He's coming into a backfield where he's sharing with James Conner, and we know just how good James Conner can be. If the Cardinals are trying to win, I feel like they need to be giving James Conner the first touches and using Trey Benson to spell him. Realistically, though, within a season or 2, this is going to be Trey Benson's backfield. Connor's gone after this season, assuming they don't re-sign him. So Benson is the main guy for the future, and I feel like the Cardinals are thinking a year or 2 down the road. For that reason, I don't feel like they want to put too much tread on Benson's tires. I think this is still Connor's backfield for now. So if you're trying to win anytime in the near future, I don't think Benson's a guy I'd be targeting. He's more of a long-term prospect and a guy I'd be trying to get if I'm rebuilding. He is very talented. I think there was a good chance he was the first running back off the board if Brooks had turned out to have too many injury issues for teams. But because Brooks was cleared by most teams, Benson goes second, still a very talented player in a weak running back class. Samir White's another interesting guy. He was a total disappointment in the first season when we thought he might start to take over from Josh Jacobs. In his second season, he was once again pretty disappointing, but at least got some touches. And then at the end of the year, with Jacobs unavailable or at least not being used, they gave him the ball and he was fantastic. I feel like he's going to be the clear number 1 running back this season. I know they've brought in Alexander Mattison, but he couldn't even keep the lead role over Ty Chandler, who the team didn't even believe him enough to not bring competition in for. Plus, they've got Dylan Lowry, who's a receiving back, and that makes sense. Samir White, not really the best receiving back. I feel like he'll still get some opportunities there, but on third and long, you're not putting Samir White out there. That does limit his upside, but he's the kind of guy that's going to get 100-yard rushing games and plenty of touchdowns. That has value. It also has a lower floor because those receiving yards are such a nice, safe floor to have. That's why he's a little bit lower down than a lot of other guys. But he's somebody that I think most people don't value as a top 24 running back. So for that reason, you can get him pretty cheap. He's someone I would be targeting, especially leaning on the fact that, oh no, they've brought in Alexander Mattison. It's only a committee. I'd like to have both guys in the committee and just take a gamble on it. Try to convince people that way. Number 20, another guy who was pretty disappointing last year after being a top 10 back in 2022, but that was mainly due to injuries and the fact that the Patriots just all around sucked. Their O-line took a big step back. Mac Jones has been awful. Bailey Zappi has been awful. Now they're rebuilding. It's hard to know exactly what the rebuild is going to look like. Do they have Jacoby Brissett or Drake May? Regardless, I feel like there's going to be plenty of checkdowns for Stevenson. I feel like there's going to be plenty of touches for Stevenson. To be fair, he's not going to be the receiving back. That's probably Antonio Gibson, who'll also do some change of pace work. But I feel like this is Stevenson's backfield at the moment, and I'd expect that Stevenson is going to be the main guy that I'd want in fantasy. He's not the youngest back, even though he's only played for 3 years. There is a bit of risk there, but he doesn't have that much tread on his tires. So I feel like he's a guy that you can at least take a chance on, knowing that there is a little bit of injury risk. There's a bit of situational risk, but you're probably not paying very much for him at this stage. Tony Pollard's another guy who has plenty of risk, but he's at least managed to stay healthy and play for the most part. He was obviously underused in his first few seasons, but coming out as a day 3 back, that kind of makes sense. Slowly started to take over for Zeke. Everyone was very excited last season about him. I wasn't particularly excited personally. I was very worried about how his touch value would slow down based on how they were going to use him. And it turned out that was actually correct. I finally got one right. So I think this season he'll probably bounce back if they use him in conjunction with Taj Spears, and I think they will. I think this is going to be a lightning and lightning kind of situation because neither of them is really particularly big back. But I feel like they're both good receiving backs. They've got both good running backs. I feel like the Pollard should be able to bounce back. He didn't look particularly explosive last season, but he was constantly getting banged up, running on very obvious run situations where the defense had eight in the box, stacking the box, and it meant it was very hard for him to do anything at all. It was very predictable. I feel like that Tennessee has shown they're able to run the ball effectively, even when teams know what's happening, and they're finally going to be able to throw the ball a little bit more with Will Levis and a whole lot of good wide receivers. So that should open things up a little bit for the running backs. The volume is a real question mark and the age is a concern, but we're still talking about a guy who was a top 10 back in 2022 and still ended up being solid despite being inefficient last season. David Montgomery, another guy who managed to move teams and then be pretty effective. The problem is, of course, that Jahmyr Gibbs is probably going to start to take over a little bit more. We're not getting a lot of receiving touches out of David Montgomery, so you're really needing those touchdowns, and they're starting to go a lot more to Gibbs as time goes on. That makes me a little bit nervous about Montgomery, but realistically, he's probably only going to be with the team for another season, and then they move on for him, give Gibbs the entire load, and Montgomery can go somewhere else and get plenty of touches. There's plenty of upside there. He's a good running back, but he's a good running back. He's not much of a receiver, and that is a little bit of a concern in PPR leagues. So there is some risk because of that, but I still like him as an option who can come in and give you slightly variable touchdown-dependent quality for a fair few years to come. I think that he's the kind of back that can play a little bit later because he is that sort of big back who's pretty well built. He's started to have a couple of injuries coming in lately, but he's still a guy I feel pretty good about. I'd be happy to take him anywhere outside the top 20 ahead of a lot of these riskier guys. Speaking of risky guys, 30-year-old makes his appearance here. Now, obviously, 30 is not old in most situations. It's very young compared to me, for example. But I think in running back parlance, that's talking about the kind of time where players start to fall off. Having said that, we're talking about a guy who in the last 5 seasons has 4 top 10 finishes and a top 20 finish despite playing half the games. He's very, very, very good. Derk Henry is an unbelievable running back. He's lost a bit of a step, but not much. He's still massive. He can still take down defenders, and they're starting to use him in the receiving game a lot more when he was in Tennessee. Now, does that happen in Baltimore? Well, we don't exactly know what's going to happen. They do have Keaton Mitchell. He's not the greatest receiving back, but he's okay. They'll certainly use him as that smaller, explosive change of pace back. They've got Justice Hill, who, of course, they can use on receiving downs. I think Rasheed Allen is probably just a Derek Henry replacement, someone they're trying to bring in and kind of get that bigger back ready for a season or two down the road. So Henry's the main guy for me. I think that you can still expect a reasonably good chance of a top 10 finish this season, but it's probably only going to be for a season, maybe 2. For that reason, you're not paying up for him unless you're really trying to win this season. Now, if your league is non-PPR or half PPR, Henry rises again because realistically, a lot of his value comes from touchdowns and rushing yardage. For that reason, I'm willing to pay up a little bit more for that, especially because Lamar Jackson doesn't check down much anyway. There's not much of a passing game in Baltimore to the running backs in general. So I would expect that Derek Henry is a guy that I'd be trying to get my hands on if I'm trying to win now. Most people are trying to sell him unless they're in a will now situation because they know that he's not going to give them much value. They're probably a little bit scared of the fact that we haven't had a particularly effective running back in Baltimore. I don't think that's going to be the case this year. I think he'll be excellent. Javonte Williams, on the other hand, I'm pretty nervous about. There's been a lot of bubbling behind the scenes of Sean Payton saying, it's a running back competition this year. We're just going to see what we have from these guys. Obviously, Jaleel McLaughlin wasn't used much last year. He was pretty explosive early on, but he started to fade as the year went on. They've got a receiving back in Samaje Perine, but they did start to use Williams there a little bit more. But now they've brought in Audric Esteem, who's solid. I guess he's okay, but I think this is probably still Javonte Williams' backfield. He's struggled to stay healthy. I think that this season he should be a little bit more explosive now that he's another year removed from that major injury. He's still very young. We're talking about a guy who came into the league very young, so he remains very young, but he's got a lot of tread on the tires, and that's a little bit of a concern. But I feel like he is someone that, if he can right the ship, could be effective for you for the next 5+ years. there's a bit of a risk there, and that's not necessarily a likely outcome, but it's possible. And for that reason, he's a guy I'm happy to take a shot on before these guys who are in clear committee or awkward situations. Taj Spears is a guy in an awkward committee situation. The reason I've got him this high is I'm not sure exactly how this backfield's going to work. I expect there to be a reasonably high amount of volume. And it wouldn't surprise me if they just move on from Pollard within the season or so if Spears looks like the more effective back. I'm not sure he can be an every down back, but he's shifty enough and quick enough that I think they can probably still use him on the goal line, just not as that Henry-style power back, but certainly as a guy that can get outside and get touchdowns, even though it's not going to be in the same way. So for that reason, I feel good about Spears. He's still young. There's plenty of upside there. His history of injuries is a little bit of a concern, but he's looked pretty good last season and managed to stay healthy. So I feel good about the upside there, but you're talking about a lot of risk. Alvin Kamara, speaking of risk, aging now, might have a couple of seasons left. Didn't look particularly effective last season, but he still managed to perform from a fantasy perspective because he got so many receiving yards. And with Derek Carr back, you'd have to feel like that's going to happen at least a little bit. I know that it wasn't always Derek Carr last season, but I would expect a lot of reception for Alvin Kamara. It's not like they've got a lot of wide receiving options. Their second wide receiver is Rashid Shaheed, who's a third-year undrafted free agent. So we're not talking about a lot of receiving competition. For that reason, it's going to be a lot of Kamara. They don't even really have a tight end option to speak of. Juwan Johnson's their top tight end. So we're talking about Alvin Kamara and Chris Olave and nothing else. So I feel like you're going to get a lot of reception from Kamara for maybe the next season or two. And that means you might get a season or two of quality out of him. Of course, it's entirely possible they go, nah, we're just going to give the ball to Jamal Williams to do the heavy lifting stuff. We're going to get Kendre Miller more involved because realistically we need to think about the future. We're just going to use Kamara sometimes as a bit of a receiving back and give him a little bit of early down work. That's certainly within the realms of possibility. For that reason, unless you're really trying to win now or you just need to rely on him for receiving work, you're in a pretty deep league, I'd be selling him now. I feel like this is a situation where you can still sell him based on name value, based on the fact that he had a top 10 finish last season in only 13 games. If someone's only box score reading, they're probably willing to take that. So I think this is a situation where you probably want to sell on Alvin Kamara unless you're really trying to win now. Aaron Jones is another guy that is coming towards the end of his career, but he's been excellent for quite a long time now. 4 straight top 10 seasons. Finally had some injuries last season and wasn't used the way he should have been, but looked excellent in the playoffs. We're talking about a guy who can still do it. We know that Minnesota has had some issues with their running backs lately. Alexander Madison wasn't really able to take over Dalvin Cook, who himself was starting to struggle. I think the O-line play and their ability to run the ball took a little bit of a step back. And while I like Jones, while I think he's very talented, I'm very nervous about his ability to perform in this backfield. Do they give him enough touches to make him relevant regardless? We've seen them do that a lot with Cook, and then we thought they were going to do that with Madison before Ty Chandler took over. Do they finally go committee and go Aaron Jones and Ty Chandler? I'm not entirely sure. If they do, it's probably Ty Chandler who's getting the early down carries and Jones who's getting the receiving work, I think. Although it could go either way. You just don't know in these situations. There's a lot of risk there. And because there's a lot of risk and because he's aging, I'm taking him later on. But there's also a lot of upside. He could have a top 10 finish if he's given every down work, which is a thing they like to do with the Vikings. So I can imagine a situation where he's excellent, but I can certainly imagine a situation where he's pretty mediocre. So plenty of risk here, but plenty of upside. Speaking of upside, Devin Singletary, one of the smallest backs in the league. I think he's 5'8" or something like that, maybe even 5'6". He's very short, but they still managed to use him a little bit on the goal line. He's still effective. I like the idea of taking a shot on Devin Singletary, but I'm very nervous about his long-term chances. He is the main back in New York. There's no clear back behind him. We're talking about Eric Gray, Tyron Tracy is just a 6th-round guy coming in. Quite an older 6th-round player as well. So I feel like this is Singletary's backfield. There are a lot of people that are saying, no, he's going to be done last season in Houston. It's all to Dameon Pierce. And yet Singletary was the main guy, and he remained the main guy for most of the season. I feel like we probably see the same thing happen as after he's moved from Houston to New York. I feel like he's probably still the main guy here now. Is that effective? Is that useful? I don't know how the Giants are going to be this year. They might be very good if Daniel Jones can turn things around. They've got Malik Neighbors now, finally. If Darren Waller doesn't retire, they could have a lot of weapons there, and Singletary could be the main beneficiary. He's still pretty young. He's experienced, but he's young enough that he can still give you a few more seasons. I think there's upside here. He's a guy I'm willing to take a shot on, assuming no one else in your league is thinking along the same lines. Nick Chubb's the guy I'm very nervous about. I love Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb is such a talented player. I got him in so many dynasty leagues. So I was devastated after that injury last season. And I truly don't know if he's going to come back from it. When he's on the field and he's healthy, he is legitimately the best running back in the league. He is getting to that age now where he's going to start losing a step, and that's concerning. He's not the greatest receiving back, so there's a massive amount of risk here. Realistically, this could just be Jerome Ford's backfield and Nick Chubb's barely involved, and we don't see much of him again. It is possible, but it's also possible he's still Nick Chubb and he's one of the best players in the league. So for that reason, I'm willing to take a shot on him, especially if I'm trying to win now and I'm willing to get someone cheap. The problem is people are generally going to hold on to players based on name value. So you've got to find the right person who believes that injury risk is high enough and is either rebuilding or isn't willing to take it. So use all the information you have to try to get it together. Nji Harris. Wasn't a shock to me at all that Jalen Warren started to take over. I was talking about that all last season. I think the same is going to happen again. We're going to have another thunder and lightning situation. But Nji Harris, after a while last season, actually started to look sneakily good. Now, the interesting thing is that they have turned down his fifth year option, I should say. Now, I think that's more of a case than just not wanting to pay a running back that much money. But I think there's a good chance that he's out of Pittsburgh by next season. Will another team take a chance on him? Well, we're talking about a first-round running back, and we're talking about a guy who hasn't lost his talent. He's just being used in strange ways. He was the number 3 overall running back in his first season. That hasn't gone away. I think they've started to use Jalen Warren a lot more because they like what they have in Warren, but Harris is still a good back, and he's still performing pretty effectively. The Steelers' run game does tend to be pretty good, but wasn't at its greatest last season. So it's hard to know exactly what to expect from him moving forward. But I think this season we see, running back to kind of low running back to sort of performances, sprinkled in with a couple of disappointing games. As other players get injured, he'll start to rise up a little bit. He's a guy you can rely on as a flex option or a running back 2 option. But I think next season, if he moves on and goes to another team, he could go into a clear starting role situation and become the sort of back that we want him to be. He's still young enough, so he's someone I'd like the idea of taking a risk on. Brian Robinson is another guy that you can take a risk on, but it is a risk. We know Austin Ekeler goes in there, and Austin Ekeler looked kind of washed at the end of last season, but he's still a solid receiving back. So it's possible that Brian Robinson is the pretty much every single down back, but Austin Ekeler comes in there on a lot of third downs, get some other random touches here and there. But as the season goes on, I would expect the coaching staff might realize Eckler's a little bit washed and they might give Robinson a lot more touches. So there is certainly some upside there. He was a 21st overall running back last season. He looked pretty good in his first season at all when he wasn't getting shot and other things like that. So for that reason, I like the idea of taking a pot shot on him, especially if you're not in a PPR league, because you're not going to get a lot of receiving down work. That's why he's quite low here. Zack Moss is another guy, very talented, probably the lead running back in Cincinnati. I know that there was a lot of talk that Chase Brown was that guy. I think they gave Chase Brown a go last season, and then they realized he's solid, but we need another guy. Chase Brown can be used as a change of pace back. He can be used as a receiving back, but I think Zack Moss is going to get a lot of touches. We saw him play nearly every down in some games last season in Indy, and he looks really good because everyone looks good for the Colts. But even when Jonathan Taylor came back, he's still got some touches. He had some off games. He's not the kind of guy who's going to perform every week, but he is a good, solid player. I think he's a fantastic pickup for Cincinnati. I think it's just a really smart footballing move. Will they use him as the top guy? I hope so. I really like Zack Moss. I liked him back when he was in Buffalo, and I liked him in Indy. I think he has a lot of upside, but he is getting a little bit older. So you're taking him as a guy who can perform for the next season or two, particularly if you're a bit weak at running back and need to take a couple of pot shots on guys. Rico Gathers is another guy I like the idea of taking a pot shot on. Realistically, they've brought back Zeke Elliott, but I mean, he's not the Zeke Elliott that we're so used to. He's been poor for a couple of years now. He still did some good stuff in New England. He's reliable and he's a pretty good teammate, despite everything you sometimes hear about him. I think that this is more of a situation than bringing back a veteran and trying to bring something out of their younger guys. And I feel like Rico Dowdle's the main guy. He's been at Dallas for quite a while now. This will be his 5th season with the team. He got a little bit of work towards the end of last season. He looked pretty good. So I feel like now that he's finally recovered from that injury back in 2021, which really nearly knocked him out for 2 seasons, realistically, I feel like that we could see a lot more production out of him this year. I think he could be the lead running back, and he could get a lot of the value touches with Zeke doing a lot of the heavy every down work. I feel like this is sort of like a old school Zeke and Tony Pollard situation, but it's now a Zeke and Rico Dowdle, and Dowdle gets a few more touches because Zeke isn't able to handle the same workload as he used to be. So there's plenty of upside there. Of course, the downside is he's actually not involved at all. And they go for somebody else, or they bring in somebody else, or they just give everything to Zeke. There's a whole heap of other things that could happen here. There's not a lot of natural competition on the depth chart. I don't actually believe in any of the other guys they've got there. I don't believe in Malik Davis. I don't believe in Vaughn. I think they're just guys. Vaughn's probably more of a special teams guy who'll be used occasionally on third downs. Davis is essentially a practice squad guy. I think it's probably Dowdle. I'm really talking myself into it. Hopefully I've talked you into it. Have a go on it. Just put him on the end of your roster. I managed to get him in the 4th round of a rookie draft because we were able to draft players who were free agents. No one is looking at this guy at all. People are taking all sorts of randos. Mike White, the Miami backup quarterback in a 1 QB league, went before Rico Dowdle in this league. And this is not a dumb league. People just are not looking at him. Realistically, you can get him cheap, and you should get him cheap. James Conner, another guy you can get cheap. You can always get him cheap. He's an excellent running back. For me, he's probably, on ability alone, maybe even a top 5 running back in the league. And when I say running back, I mean the big picture. He's great receiving back, great every down back, fantastic goal line back. When he took over from Le'Veon Bell, we just went, oh, well, Pittsburgh's fantastic at running the ball. No, he's really good. Okay, we're talking about a guy who could have had an amazing career if he could just stay healthy. He had that one top 10 finish in 2021, but other than that, he's just been injured every single season. And for that reason, they brought in Trey Benson. I feel like they probably keep using quite a bit of James Conner and run him into the ground, and then they can give the ball to Trey Benson after that. So I feel like you're going to get a little bit of quality out of James Conner. So if you're trying to win down your running backs a week, you can get him pretty cheap. I feel like you can probably get him for a 2nd or 3rd round rookie pick. I would probably do it for a 3rd round if you're really desperate, maybe a late 2nd round. But he's someone that I think is probably going to perform for you early on this season at least. Blake Corum, this is a really interesting one. I did not love the landing spot when it happened. I was really disappointed. There's so many good landing spots he could have gone to. I thought it would have been really interesting if he went to the Giants, for example. Would have been fantastic if he went to Dallas. I feel like he's a guy that, even though he's pretty small, he can play on every down. So I was hoping that would happen. He goes to LA, where Kyren Williams is the main back. I think he's just a backup. I think he gets a little bit of receiving down work, maybe some early down work. He's certainly going to spell Williams occasionally, but I think he's only going to have quality if Kyren Williams is injured. And if Williams is injured, we're probably talking about an every down back. And likewise, if Corum's injured, I feel like Williams is probably an every down back because Ronnie Rivers ain't it. So I feel like there is some upside with Corum, but you're mainly keeping him as a handcuff and a guy that you can start on bye weeks who's going to get enough receptions and maybe just enough touches between the Williams touches to get you at least through a bye week. So he's not someone I'd reach for, but he's someone that at least is still a rookie. He's going to have a long career ahead of him, and he's got enough quality that I feel like you can make use of him and expect that he's going to be around the league, at least getting touches for the next 5 seasons. Jalen Warren worries me a lot. A lot of people are really high on him. I knew he was going to go into a good role last year, but I wasn't that high on him because I felt like that half of the Pittsburgh running back role is actually not that valuable. As it turns out, Warren's actually pretty darn good. Top 20 finish based on how few touches he got. I thought he'd need Nji Harris to get injured for him to be this good. As it turns out, he was just really effective. He had some games where he looked super explosive. He also had a few games where he was pretty disappointing, but you got to take the good with the bad. Talking about a guy who's not overly young and not overly experienced at the same time. So he might be able to play a little bit older because of the lack of tread on his tires. They don't use him on a lot of downs. Nji Harris might be out the door after this season. We could be talking about the lead running back with Pittsburgh in 2025. So there's upside there. Having said that, I think it's probably most likely they bring in another guy and they continue using a Warren in a committee. For that reason, I have him a lot lower because I think it's more likely he's just a career committee back. Zach Chabanet is a guy who was really disappointing last year. I had high hopes for him. I think he's a very talented back, but for whatever reason, the Seahawks don't see it. They seem to be latching on to Kenneth Walker and holding on tight. Walker, realistically, not that much older than Chabanet, only has one less year of contract. I'm very nervous that Chabanet is going to be stuck behind Walker for at least the next 2 seasons, and that really lowers his value for me. I think Walker's the main running back here. Chabanet is literally just the backup who'll get plenty of touches if Walker gets injured. We are getting into that backup situation, so this is one of the last guys who's a legitimate chance of being an actual starter. The Chargers have let go of Austin Ekeler. They don't have any quality below him. They haven't even brought back Joshua Kelly. Isaiah Spiller was the number 3 back last year, and he's still the number 3 back. It's Gus Edwards. It's JK Dobbins. Now, you could argue, well, Dobbins is clearly the better back. He was the lead back whenever he was healthy with the Ravens, but when was he healthy? He was very rarely healthy, and he's probably not going to be healthy this season. So I think Edwards is probably at least initially the lead back. Problem is he's not a great receiving back, so they're going to give some receiving touches to other players. Who exactly? I mean, I don't know. I feel like they really need to bring someone in. I really don't know that Vidal's going to be that guy. I also don't think he's that much of a threat to either of these guys either. So I'm not sure exactly who's going to get the receiving work. It might be that it's just very little receiving work to the running backs and a lot of running down touches. But we're talking about a situation where this offense is moving into the Harbaugh direction. They're kind of doing a lot of Baltimore-style stuff. And we know that means a lot of rushing. And for that reason, I think there's some upside here with Edwards. Talking about a guy who was 22nd overall running back last season, I don't think it's out of the question that happens again, or even if he gets a little bit higher, if Dobbins isn't as explosive as we're hoping. They've given Edwards a pretty small contract. It's about $3 million a year, but they've given Dobbins a smaller one. It's about half that size again, partially because of the injury risk, admittedly. So I think both Edwards and Dobbins are guys I'm willing to take a pot shot on because this Chargers offense could actually be pretty run heavy. And for that reason, you want the running backs, and I'd happily take both of them and just see what happens. Most of the time when it's likely to be a committee, I try to avoid that situation. But I think in this situation, there is a good chance that one of them turns into the every down back. I think it's a situation where there's going to be so many touches, they might just have value anyway. Austin Ekeler has me very nervous. I got quite a bit of Austin Ekeler last season, early in the season, when he had a couple of poor games, because I assumed he was going to bounce back because he's Austin Ekeler. Clearly, he's hit that wall. And for that reason, he drops off for me. He goes to Washington, which is an interesting situation. They're having a little bit of a rebuild. He mainly is, I expect, the passing down back. With Jaden Daniels, that makes me a little bit nervous. Daniels has a tendency to run instead of passing. And for that reason, I don't know that he's going to get that many touches. We also didn't see it being particularly effective for Antonio Gibson. So the upside here is that he's Austin Ekeler and that he's able to play like Austin Ekeler after being disappointed last season, possibly because of injury. That's the hope, and that's the upside. But we're talking about a guy who's 28 years old. That's the kind of age where running backs are definitely starting to fall off. So there's good reason to be nervous about Austin Ekeler. I would be more inclined to sell him based on name value, but if you can get him really cheap, he's someone I'm willing to take a pot shot on. Raheem Mostert is another guy who's really only got a season or two left. But we're talking about a guy who was a top 3 running back last season. Obviously, they brought in more competition. They bring in Wright. But I don't know that Jalen Wright's going to be the guy taking a lot of touches off Mostert. I feel like this is still Mostert and Achane. And then when Mostert inevitably gets injured, because that's kind of been his career, we see a whole lot more of Achane and Wright. I feel like they're going to spread it around a little bit between these running backs, but Mostert's still the main guy for me. And for that reason, I'm happy to hold on to him, knowing that he was a top 3 back last time. He got a lot of touchdowns. You might just get that production again this year. I'm happy to take a shot on him. Now, I'm not going to go through the photos because I really didn't want to spend any more time making photos of everyone else. Plus, realistically, I'm not going to say as much about those guys. Bucky Irving and Ray Davis have already spoken about. Really thinking about moving Davis up a little bit. I do like the chances of him doing quite a lot with the Bills. But realistically, James Cook being there is a little bit of a damper for me. Bucky Irving's a guy that I like, but more of a receiving back. And for that reason, I think he lacks upside, but they're still probably among the better running backs of this rookie class. Jerome Ford has upside at least. If Nick Chubb just isn't the Nick Chubb we know, he'll probably be the lead running back, and that gives him a lot of upside. But I'm not convinced that's going to be the situation. I'm not convinced that even if that happens, the lead running back there means he's going to be playing every down. I think we see a lot of Donta Foreman probably. Could see Kareem Hunt coming back. I don't know how they're going to use Ford. He's also struggled to stay healthy a little bit. So I'm nervous about him, which is why he's not higher up. Jalen Wright I talked about briefly just before. I'm not sure how Miami's going to use him. I think he's probably a couple of years away from being a really reliable option. Clearly, he's no Devin Achane. I don't really believe in his ability to take over that backfield. For that reason, you're talking about a guy who's probably a committee back and probably in the back half of that committee. JK Dobbins has so much injury risk that he's lower than most people for me, but he's still a guy I'm happy to take a pot shot on because he's JK Dobbins. He's a talented back. He's only 25. If he can recover from this injury, we're talking about a backfield that's going to have a lot of touches, and his competition is only Gus the Bus, who's mostly a early down running back. I feel like Dobbins could get a lot of touches and maybe even the receiving work, which would be new for him. Chuba Hubbard, obviously now the backup in Carolina, but we're talking about a guy who was at least at times the starting back last year. I feel like there's still the potential that this is a committee. I don't think it will be, but I think he's probably one of the more valuable backups because they just don't have much behind him. Miles Sanders is clearly not the guy. They brought in Penny, but we saw last year that he was like on and off the practice squad. He was inactive most games. So I feel like Hubbard is the main backup here. It wouldn't surprise me at all if he is out of town very soon. Anyway, he's in the last year of his contract, and because he has that history as a starting running back, I feel like there's a bit of upside there. Chase Brown also has a bit of upside, but realistically, I do think this is probably Zack Moss's backfield. I feel like Brown is just a backup. He's going to get a little bit of receiving work, a little bit of change of base stuff. I'm not overly excited by him. Same thing with Ty Chandler. I think it's probably Aaron Jones' backfield. The fact that they were willing to bring Aaron Jones in when Ty Chandler had already been given an opportunity to start, I think says a lot, especially because I'm not sure that they really win now. Obviously, they've got Sam Darnold and JJ McCarthy. I don't think either of those guys we are going to win this season. I feel like they're probably a good season away. So I don't really understand why they bring in Aaron Jones if they believed even remotely in Ty Chandler, and that makes me very nervous about him. Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson, obviously with the Bears. I'm not interested in either of those guys because they brought in DeAndre Swift, but we have at least seen them perform a little bit, and we've seen Swift get injured, which is why I have those guys ranked a little bit higher. If Swift gets injured, we saw Herbert get plenty of touches at times, and Roschon Johnson is still a guy they paid a reasonable amount for in draft capital. I feel like there's at least a little bit of upside. I can't work out exactly how to value those guys because of the Swift situation. Could end up being some sort of weird committee as well. Everyone below this is mainly a backup. Tyler Algier, obviously the backup to Bijan. He's not going to get as many touches this year, but he's valuable if Bijan gets injured. Will Shipley to the Eagles. Again, I feel like there's upside if Barkley gets injured, which he often does. It's possible it just becomes Shipley's backfield. They clearly don't believe too much in Kenny Gainwell, or they wouldn't have brought Shipley in. Marshawn Lloyd to the Packers is a really weird one because they brought in Josh Jacobs. I feel like this is more of an A.J. Dillon replacement. So I feel like we're talking about them bringing in a mainly backup running back who might take over in a couple of seasons. A lot of people will have him way higher than this. Let them draft him. I'm not interested. Keaton Mitchell to the Ravens. I think his value could increase if Henry gets injured because I think that if that happens, he probably is technically the number one running back, but you see a whole lot of alley. They might even bring someone else in. I don't think there's a lot of upside. I don't think he's someone who can be an every down back, but there's at least enough potential there that I'm willing to take a pot shot on him. Ezekiel Elliott's a guy that if you are trying to win now and you're desperate for a running back, you can probably get Elliott pretty cheap. The problem is a lot of people think that he's going to be the starter in Dallas. I don't think that's the case. He's only 28, but he's a pretty old-looking, slow 28. He's done a lot of running over the years. His body is starting to fall apart. I'm very nervous about his ability to perform. I like Rico Dowdle a whole lot more. Antonio Gibson's another guy that I feel like has the potential to at least get touches in New England. I think he's probably the receiving back mainly. Of course, he is a converted wide receiver, but I mean, Ramondre Stevenson is clearly the main guy. Unless he gets injured, you're not going to see a lot of Gibson. And even if he gets injured, I'm not sure exactly what role Gibson will have. But we're talking about a guy who has been an effective running back in the league not that long ago. So there's at least a bit of upside there because he's still quite young. In fact, he's only a year older than Isaac Guerrero. I'm not really sure what the 49ers are doing here. Is this a post-CMC plan? I mean, we're talking about a guy who's only 3 years younger. I'm not sure that it is. I think they just want a slightly better backup because Elijah Mitchell hasn't really been able to perform the way they wanted to. They just love drafting running backs. Ty Davis-Price was a little bit of a bust. They just have bust after bust at running back, which is why they had to stop drafting them. They're a pretty good drafting team. Mason, of course, who was pretty disappointing. They just keep bringing in running back rookies, and they keep being disappointing. They've done it again. He's probably going to be disappointing. Braylon Allen goes into that awkward situation in New York. He's pretty young, but he's ultimately a backup. I think he's a high-valued backup because if Bryce Hall goes down, Allen could be very effective. They also brought in Davis. They've got plenty of other guys like Michael Carter, etc. So it could be a little bit messy, but Allen at least could get the goal line touches for now and then become effective later on. Wouldn't surprise me entirely if this becomes a Detroit Lions style situation where Allen kind of plays that David Montgomery role and the Gibbs role goes to Bryce Hall. That would obviously hurt Hall a lot. I think that's a low probability chance, but I do think it's a realistic chance. I'd say it's maybe a 1 in 4 chance of that sort of thing happening. Kendra Miller's another guy who has an opportunity to take over a lead role, but he couldn't do it last year. They've still got Jamal Williams. They've still got Alvin Kamara. He's probably a good year away from really being fantasy relevant, and even then, he needs the right things to happen for him. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, of course, a former first-round pick. I loved him in fantasy when he was in college. He was fantastic with LSU. He has been disappointing with Kansas City, but I think he's probably the main receiving back and the main backup. So you never know. He might get some touches. He's someone that I take as more of a handcuff. And that's it. Thank you for checking out my Dynasty running back chat. If you have any questions, you can either pop them in the comments or message me on Instagram at @TheFantasyFirstDown or on Twitter at @FantasyFirstDown with no O. You can check out my Dynasty rankings for all other positions at ffdfantasyfootball.com. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to us because I will be back in a couple of days with my wide receiver rankings. I will see you right then.